Welcome. This is Dr. Kurt Johnson of the Light on Light Press, and you're about to view the video of the book launch of Dr. Paul J. Mills' amazing new book, Science, Being, and Becoming: The Spiritual Lives of Scientists, held in New York City on October 11th, 2022, with the author, Dr. Paul J. Mills, and his guests, Dr. Jude Currivan, Dr. Shamini Jain, Dr. Neil Theise, and Dr. Robert Atkinson. We know you're going to love this book, so let's go right over to the book launch video. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to this Light on Light Press book launch event for Science, Being, and Becoming: The Spiritual Lives of Scientists by Dr. Paul J. Mills. A book we're so pleased to say is already a #1 in pre-sales at Amazon and at other booksellers. I'm Dr. Kurt Johnson, a managing director at the Light on Light Press, an imprint of SacredStories Publishing. And I'm here with a number of special guests, each of whom will be introduced to you further as we proceed with our time together. So these special guests are, just to give you a highlight of each of them, first, the author of Science, Being, and Becoming, Dr. Paul J. Mills. And then Dr. Robert Atkinson, a 2-time Nautilus Award winner and also another managing director at Light on Light Press. And then each of Dr. Mills' special guests for this program, whom Dr. Mills will be introducing to you as he further engages each of them about this amazing book and their parts in it. So those persons are Dr. Jude Currivan, author, anthropologist, and cosmologist; Dr. Shamini Jain of Clinical Psychology and Consciousness Studies, University of California, San Diego; and we're expecting Dr. Neil Theise of New York University's Grossman School of Medicine. So our launch is being broadcast across Facebook today by the Sign Network, thanks to John Raymer, who's also with us today. And you can find out more about Light on Light at lightonlight.us and at imprints at SacredStories.com, and more about Sign at the SINE Facebook page. So we're going to start out with Dr. Mills talking about this amazing book and then calling in each of his guests. And then we're going to move to a discussion with Paul and Dr. Robert Atkinson, and then again bring on all of the guests. So Paul's going to be introducing each of his guests as each of them join us. So now to get all of this rolling, we're going to go over just to Paul and me, and that way I can tell you more about Dr. Paul Mills. So Paul J. Mills, PhD, is a professor of public health and family medicine, director of the Center of Excellence for Research and Training in Integrative Health, and the former chief of behavioral medicine at the University of California, San Diego. He has over 400 scientific publications in the fields of pharmacology, oncology, cardiology, psychoneuroimmunology, behavioral medicine, and integrative health. And he's published some of the earliest important scientific research on meditation. His work has been featured in Time Magazine, the New York Times, National Public Radio, U.S. News and World Report, Consumer Reports, the Huffington Post, Gaia TV, and WebMD, just to mention a few. And he's presented his work at hundreds of conferences and workshops all around the world, including at the United Nations. So now over to Paul to speak about the book and then to bring on each of his guests. So Paul.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Kurt, and thank you for your kind introduction. And I also want to thank you and Dr. Robert Atkinson, who's here on this launch call, and also Nomi Neem, who at Light on Light Press, and also Ariel Patricia at SacredStories Publishing for supporting the publication of this book, which without all of your support and wisdom and guidance, it literally would not exist. So I'm very grateful and thank you for that. Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this launch. I'm very excited. I have a lot of energy. I'm a little bit edgy because of it, and I'm grateful that you joined. Before we get into our conversation, I want to tell you a little bit about the book, to put the book into perspective before we launch into our conversations, our discussions amongst all the guests. Essentially, the book is about the journey of human consciousness development, essentially often called a spiritual development, the spiritual path that all human beings are on. Whether a person is aware of it or not, we are each on this journey. We're each seeking to understand the nature of our own existence, the nature of the world around us. Who are we really, and what are we fundamentally? This book answers those questions through the eyes of over 30 scientists whom I interviewed. I interviewed them and asked them to share with me their deeply personal, transpersonal experiences, their metaphysical experiences, their mystical experiences, and how those experiences transformed them, transformed their worldview, transformed their lives, and also fundamentally, how did it transform their science? As many of you know, science has been deeply, deeply divided for centuries, really, divided in terms of the nature of the spiritual world, the mystical, the metaphysical. Typically, science outright rejects that these domains even exist for the realms of the human being and beyond. This has often been called the dogma of materialism. Science says basically what exists is everything you see with your physical eyes, that we as human beings are simply our mind, body, our thoughts, our emotions, our genes, essentially, and that being very deterministic, and that's really our fundamental nature. But many of us know by personal experience, different religions we've studied and philosophies we've studied, that there's much, much more. But unfortunately, this science, the dogma of materialism, has kept science from opening the doors for real serious investigation into the nature of what is beyond, who we are fundamentally. So the scientists I've interviewed in this book worked hard to really confront this nature of materialism, the dogma of materialism, to overcome that and step into their own mystical and metaphysical existence. And they shared with me those deep experiences and how it has changed them, and importantly, changed their science. Why is it important that it's changed science? Because science, having closed the doors to these realms, which are fundamentally important to us, not only for our existence, but they also just provide deep meaningfulness to our sense of life. Those of us who can probe into these areas, it helps us overcome sense of separation and helps us embrace a more unitive worldview. So from my point of view, the book is for everyone, really. It's for lay people, it's for citizen scientists, it's for scientists, to encourage all of us to begin to embrace a journey of self-discovery, often called consciousness development, spiritual development, find deeper meaning into the nature of our very existence. And I encourage you to do that for those of you who already have not, and allow the fruits of these journeys, the fruits of getting to know yourself really fundamentally, and how that will transform your life. And that's the fundamental message of the book. And I think it's a great read. The stories amongst all the scientists are woven into a larger narrative of what's often called the monomyth, or the hero or the heroine's journey. Journeys that all of us are on during the course of our lives. For the foreword of the book, Deepak Chopra sets the stage really by discussing the long-standing divide between materialism of science and the spiritual. And he puts into perspective why that's been, and then how this book helps address and hopefully dent that divide a bit. And Ken Wilber, in a special commentary, he shares his deep wisdom on the fundamental stages of our personal journeys along the so-called spiritual development. And there's a lot of insight there that helps set the stage for the rest of the book. So with that, I'd like to move on to our first guest. That will be Dr. Jude Currivan. Jude is very much by nature a mystic, also a cosmologist, a futurist, a writer. And Jude, I very much have enjoyed reading your books. We've had a chance to chat on previous occasions. And what I thought would be helpful for those watching this launch live is to get an understanding of how you as a scientist, you really, as a young person, had deep insight into the metaphysical, to the mystic, and that took you to want to become a scientist, to use the tools of science to understand, well, what is really the nature of everything? And I'm wondering, that journey for you, how did having that perspective all along help you influence your scientific discoveries? And how did it help you in terms of a comparison to your other colleagues in cosmology, for example, who don't have that perspective? How has your discoveries been different, and I would hope and imagine more rich?
Thank you, Paul. And again, congratulations on the wonderful book. And it's so timely because it feels to me that it's part of our collective awakening at the moment. You know, this evolutionary impulse that I'm sure you and Bob will speak about a little bit later, where we are literally remembering, waking up to remember we're inseparable. So that the scientific paradigm that's prevailed for quite some time, as you say, of materialist separation. And what's so exciting for me now, and for all of us, I think, is the leading edge evidence at all scales of existence is turning it upside down. But rather more than that, it's actually healing that fragmentation into a remembered wholeness, which, of course, universal wisdom teachings have always guided us with. And your sense of, the spiritual journey invites us into that deeper relationship with the fundamental nature of reality. So for me, I was a mystic, as it were, an everyday mystic. I never went up the top of a mountain and meditated too often, but I did from a very early age experience the world in these wider realms, these deeper, wider realms of being. And so for me, my curiosity drew me into that lifelong exploration. And so I was very fortunate in having many multidimensional, spiritual, metaphysical, whatever we want how to speak of them, experiences. But that was showing me something, that my curiosity to also understand the nature of this realm, this reality, was really coming across and against the tenets of the scientific paradigm, because what I was experiencing was not what I was being taught at school. And I had that sort of, why is this? And so I went to Oxford University, I did a master's degree in physics, and I specialized in quantum physics and cosmology, because I really wanted to understand, as far as those teachings were, how what I was experiencing actually came into contact with this reality. And that's been a lifelong journey. Mm-hmm. The thing that's kept me going is a wonderful man called Professor Dennis Sharma. And Dennis was a teacher at Oxford when I was there. And he was the mentor to Stephen Hawking, who I'm sure most of us know the name of. Mm-hmm. And Dennis said something that's held me in good stead ever since. He said, follow the evidence wherever it leads. Don't let others, however their views are, push you off that urge, that curiosity to understand, and realize that the world is greater than perhaps any of us have any appreciation of. So that's been my journey. So I've never had that sort of sense of peer pressure, because it took me beyond academia. So I was never in an academic environment, therefore limited by that perception. And what it led me to, and has led me to, are discoveries and an ability to bring together discoveries of others across many, many different realms of research and scales of existence into this holism, this perspective that our universe meaningfully exists and purposefully evolves as a unified, sentient entity. And it thrilled me beyond words that this year's Nobel Prizes for physics went to 3 people, 2 of whom, Alan Aspect and Anton Zeilinger, have been themselves on this journey of curiosity into a unified nature of reality for many years. And there was an article in the New York Times, I think yesterday, that talks about how black holes may tell us that we're living in a holographic universe, which, given that my previous book was called The Cosmic Hologram,
Yep.
is saying, okay, we're on this road together. And I think your book is so wonderfully insightful and timely. So we don't have to choose science or spirituality. They're converging into, as Ken would say, an integral understanding of reality itself.
Beautiful. Thank you, Jude. I appreciated quite a number of points you just made, including the unitive worldview. And when people embark on this journey of consciousness development, the spiritual development, it naturally provides that. It begins to change a person's perception. So that becomes the overriding reality, not separation. And then each of us, regardless of what type of life and career we're living, that becomes the dominant theme, the dominant perception on a feeling level. And that makes all the difference. So I want to come back when we go to our broader discussion on some of these themes. I want to turn now. Well, first, I want to say hello to Dr. Neil Theise, who has just joined us. And Neil, we're going to get to you in a moment after Shamini. We're going to have a couple of questions, and then we're going to join as a group. Shamini, I'm so pleased to see you and to have you here on this call. Well, of course, I know a fair amount about your educational program at the University of California, San Diego, which was in many ways a traditional education. You learned about the human being on a psychological level, more traditional perspectives, physiological level, anatomy, chemistry, and all of that, all again from a traditional scientific level. But you've been on another journey in parallel to that, which was to understand really more what's often called the esoteric aspects of the human being, beyond the physical, beyond our typical thoughts and feelings, more the bioenergetic side. And I'd like you to speak a little bit about that. How has that journey been for you, knowing the traditional sciences and, say, this non-traditional parallel path? How has that transformed you and your work and those around you, which it has quite a bit because you founded the Consciousness and Healing Initiative, which has transformed many people's lives?
Paul, thank you. First of all, congratulations. I can't even describe how special this is for me as your previous mentee and now dear friend to witness this launch date. It's really, the book is fabulous. As I mentioned to you, I just devoured it in a couple of days. And it was so fun to read about the stories of my friends, some of which I had known, many who serve on the Consciousness and Healing Initiative, Scientific Advisory Council. Just first of all, congratulations, just amazing. And
thank you.
I also want to echo what Jude said, and then also place it in the realities of what it means to conduct research in these areas still today. So as Jude said, we're coming closer and closer, and our newest Nobel laureates are helping pave that way, as well as her and so many others, to knowing that we don't have to choose. And yet, as you mentioned, we are still living in a pretty three-dimensional structure when it comes to academic research, healthcare integration of healing practices. And so it's a challenging time for scientists, both seasoned and new. And so for me, of course, holding both of those worlds, there was always, as you know, sort of a rebellious part of myself that would say, well, no, we don't have to choose. So why am I being forced to choose? And as you recall, Paul, for those who don't know, Paul was my PhD thesis mentor at UC San Diego. And actually, Paul, I would love to share the story that I feel like the one story that is missing in your book in the mentorship side, and love to share my mentorship story with you because I think it's so meaningful. As you know, when I came to the program, because it was a very highly rigorous, top 5 program in clinical psychology in the US, and most of what we focused on was cognitive behavioral therapy type of approaches. Mindfulness was still considered very new, and I had to sort of, fight a little bit to get us placements in mindfulness, which of course now is very mainstream, but 20 years ago it wasn't. And I remember calling you and saying, Paul, I know that this is a very traditional program. And I really enjoyed our conversations during our internship. I'm thinking of taking up my deferment at UCSD, moving from Arizona to there because I want to be clinical. And I know that I want to do a research study in energy healing. I don't know exactly how it's going to turn out. I don't know what patient population I want to do, but I know there's something here. There's something about the biofield and the energy aspect of the work that is just not really being looked at in science, and I think it's important. And Paul, as you know, most mentors in those traditional schools are quite discouraging. And many of our colleagues and your colleagues and mentors were not very excited about us moving in this direction. But I will never forget that phone call. You had, at that point for me, that was where the mentorship started. Because to even just get that breath and that reflection and that, yeah, I think we can do that. And then because of your mentorship at UCSD, not only were we able to publish the first and only randomized placebo-controlled trial in energy healing for fatigue breast cancer survivors, but the Consciousness and Healing Initiative, I'm quite certain would likely not exist today if it weren't for your mentorship. And I want people to know that, because what you did for me as a mentor, navigating through an environment, colleagues, elder mentors as well, and people that were really not only not understanding this work, but sort of a little bit actively against it. Okay.
Yeah.
It was very difficult. And yet through your mentorship, you not only trained me on how to have sound scientific methodology, how to write grants, how to write papers, how to deepen my understanding of the healing process, but as a mentor, and I share this because I think it's so important for all of us that might be watching, who are in a position to be mentors, or those of us who are seeking mentorship. A mentor can not only just shape a student, but really shape the field. And I really feel like that is what you did for me and for the field, Paul, because you enabled us to all recognize that, no, we don't have to choose. We can take the best of science and apply it to the understandings of the so-called esoteric, the healing, the hidden dimensions of the psyche, for uncovering profound healing. And for me, you were not only just a mentor in the sense of learning how to write the grants and write the papers, but also how to hold the space, how to actually come in and facilitate change in environments that aren't always welcoming of a new frontier. And by simply watching you and absorbing the way that you navigated those challenges, I learned a tremendous amount that we don't have to have chips on our shoulders. It's not an us versus them. And we're really coming from a point of understanding that we are not separate. Then it's just a matter of communication and aligning with values. And so I just wanted to thank you for, that hidden story that is not in the book of the incredible mentorship that I received from you, and say that I think it's very vital to the field.
Thank you, Shamini. I very much appreciate your enthusiasm for this launch and that story, because as you were describing it, it's really a kind of a prototypic example of the conflict and the contrast that has existed in science, certainly within our lifetime and before. And there are ways to navigate it, and there are ways to embrace both and look at the fruition of your own career now and all the benefits downstream from the Consciousness and Healing Initiative. So thank you for that. If I do a second edition, I'll put that story in there. How's that?
Sounds great.
All right, I want to move on to our next guest, a dear friend, Dr. Neil Theise, and he's a professor at the New York University Grossman School of Medicine. Neil, I so enjoyed our interview together. I laughed a lot. You had so many interesting, fun stories, and just your nature and your attitude about your work, embracing the metaphysical and mystical along the way of your science and your medical work. And one of the things I want to bring up and ask you to comment on, because it's very much in theme of what we discussed so far. And it was something you shared in the book. You called it a gifted moment. And it was a deep insight you had as a result of much of your Zen Buddhism meditation. And that insight had to do with what you described as the emptiness of inherent existence, which you can describe if you want. But beyond that, you also shared that those moments of insight and what they all did to your own inner life radically transforms your capacity to move forward with your scientific work and with your medical work. Because part of that, you had your kind of Zen mystical life in one box in your brain. That's how you put it. And in that same box, you also had just your own family history. You shared with me, your mom really lived in the world of magical realism, which if you want to share with the audience what that means, please. But then you had your other box of science, medicine, which Shamini and Jude have described earlier, and the linearity of that and the separation of that. But that gifted moment, those boxes were somehow unified. And very importantly, and I tried to make this message in the book, it opened up a vast swath of creativity for you. You were always creative, obviously, but it also led to just much more openness, kind of downloading of ideas and insights and creativity, which has had a really profound effect on your work going forward. So please, whatever you'd like to share about that, I'd love to hear it.
You just said it. Thank you for doing my job. Congratulations on the book. Being in the middle of mine now, and I'm like, how did he do this with, you were so calm when I was speaking to you. Not what I've learned writing experiences are necessarily like. And our conversation for the book actually just felt like it was the continuity of my conversations with you and Tiffany since we met. Mm-hmm. And I can't remember which meeting we first met at. It might have been Sand, but it's just always been that kind of easy and fun. Fun being the most important part of it, I think. I had a different experience than Jude. I had this sort of double vision, and I was contented letting it be a double vision. I didn't have any particular drive to explain one in terms of the other, maybe because I'm a Gemini. But I sort of resisted any imperative. And in general, when I've done whatever academics I've done, it's really never been with a problem I felt I needed to solve. I just sort of followed my nose. And when I was younger, I followed my nose into something until something else attracted me. So The Universe and Dr. Einstein, a teacher gave me that book by Lincoln Barnett in 7th grade. And suddenly I was a physicist. Then I was off into geology and archaeology for a while. And then I discovered the 30 years that shook physics, and was suddenly a quantum physicist. And, so I sort of bounced around and just followed my nose. Going to medical school was more of a pragmatic decision. And I was expecting to wind up very solidly in clinical practice. That was my first ambition. But that led me, following my nose, into pathology, where I sit looking in a microscope all day, looking at pieces of people rather than the whole patient. And my research followed on that, looking at human tissues. And that eventually got me into stem cell research. And then that finally, after 20 years of being in medicine, took me back into a laboratory to learn basic science stuff. And so that stem cell work was about how cells are moving through the body between organs to become cells of other organs, something called stem cell plasticity, which is still controversial, although not for me. At the time, puzzling out how cells could be moving around the body and doing things that were beyond what I had been taught and beyond what were expected became very much like a koan, as we say in Zen practice, like, little problems that are unsolvable by the intellect, like what's the sound of one hand clapping? It's not that. It's something else. And at the same time, I was involved in Zen practice. I had been at that point for 10 to 15 years. And the methods of Zen practice, in part the constant bringing your attention back to the present moment as your mind drifts. You can't stop yourself from thinking, but as it does, can you recognize it and bring it back? And one of the functions of a koan in koan practice is that it gives you something to come back to, and with a sense of urgency that you're sort of compelled to come back to it. And this idea of the cells in the bodies of the mice we were studying, the cells that I knew we were seeing in the human tissues that I get from my clinical work, I started to become aware that these were cells in my body. This was not separate from me. It wasn't something outside me that I was looking at, and which is perhaps more easy to reach because I'm looking in a scope at cells all day, rather than I'm thinking, Jude, when you're studying physics, how do you have to extend your imagination to feel yourself part of the thing you're studying? Because it's at such a remove by scale. Whereas this is actually very close by. And there were times during those months where this became sort of an acute obsession with me. I just couldn't stop thinking about it like a koan. What are my cells doing? I found myself at a street corner on 20th Street and Park Avenue in New York, and the light changed and I couldn't take the step off the curb because I'd become a flock of cells in my mind and there was nothing to direct the step until I sort of gathered myself back. And then sometime around there, the moment you're talking about, at that point, I was the morning opener for the Village Zendo, which has been my Zen home for 30 years. And that particular morning, there was no one else there. It was just me and the empty Zendo, which was very peaceful and quiet. And there was light coming in behind me through the window, and there were dust motes sort of floating and glinting. And on the other side, I had lit the incense on the altar as part of the opening of the Zendo. And rather than, I think at that point, I was just following my breath, or I was doing shikantaza, just open presence awareness, but I couldn't do the Zen practice I had assigned myself. I was doing this cell contemplation thing. And, really obsessively, I couldn't let it go, like a koan. And then at some point during that, I looked up, I always get choked up when I talk about this. I probably did on the phone with you. I looked up and saw the altar and I saw the incense stick turning into smoke. And it suddenly occurred to me, smoke, incense, cells, this thing that I call my body. What's the difference? And the difference, and Jude, you alluded to this, I think, as I was coming in, that depending on scale, you get a very different view of what's an object and what's not an object. And it's all a matter of perspective. And there's no correct answer. The stick is the smoke is the stick. They're not separate. They're just two complementary views of the same thing. My body is a flock of cells, as opposed to this thing I name Neil and walk around thinking I'm separate. Those are just two complementary views. And then if that's true of cells, well, are they reified things? No, they're just proteins in water. In molecules in water. And those are just atoms. And those are just subatomic particles. And then you're down to the quantum foam, and there's no there there. There's no it there. And it suddenly occurred to me, oh, this is what they talk about as the emptiness of inherent existence. Nothing is a thing at every perspective. And that's one of those weird Buddhist things. What the hell do you mean, emptiness of inherent existence? I couldn't, fine. There goes my job. Sorry. I'm on call today, but this is not something I have to take now. And then it just suddenly became so easy. So I took this in Zen practice, you go to your teacher in interview, one-on-one interview, to check your insights. And Enkyo O'Hara is my teacher. And I said, I think I got an insight into the emptiness of inherent existence. And I explained it to her. And she said, yeah. And I said, that's it? She said, yeah, it's simple. It's not easy, but it's really simple.
Yeah.
And as you said, from there, that just sort of loosened up the boundaries and the bonds of how I held interpreting data that I see under the microscope or that I see out in the world. Are there boundaries or not? Depending on my perspective, and I can choose my perspective. Boundaries come, boundaries go. And so speaking, in meetings that Shamini's held, talking about the biofield, well, at the electrical level, at the quantum level, where's the boundary of your body? It's out there. Thanks to entanglement and non-locality, it's all the way out and there's no separation at all. And so suddenly I had no interest particularly in finding a way to bring these things together, but just held them both, and eventually they merged, and then everything, like you said, opened up from there. And that was a gift. I don't know how that moment happened. The soil had been tilled.
Yep.
Seeds had been planted, and then I got out of the way.
Thank you for recounting that story, Neil, and in such a full and rich way. And I want to add that really all the interviews in the book, each of the scientists that are interviewed shared what was the fundamental insight, the experience that opened things up. So that sense of separation or prior limited identity of I am a person only in this body with my thoughts and feelings, and led to an openness and then a connectivity to everything and everyone around them. And of course, this isn't just limited to scientists. The book is an interview with scientists simply because of my own interest in science and the efforts to transform science so it starts to help us more rather than hinder us as people, as a society, as a world, to help us uncover these same kind of insights for everyone and to transform us. And that's the message of the book. Well, I'd like to open it up just for any free flow conversation or comments around that. And really how, if those of you who are on the call can share, how might this book be of further service to really anyone who reads it? I mean, it's written that way. It's not a scientific book. I don't go into all the details of different theories and sciences. It's really personal journeys of human beings along their own spiritual development. These people happen to be scientists, but it's obviously applicable to all of us.
Yeah, well, I think what I'll do is step in a minute, Paul, because I noticed that the book has been lurking behind you, that some people may not be familiar with the cover. And so we'll kind of blast everybody with this beautiful cover right now. But the cover is very consistent with the message that you just talked about. And I just wanted to say, of course, my doctorate's in evolution and ecology, and the complementarity that Neil mentioned, I just want to bring in here too, because it's interesting that the evolutionary paradigm now in understanding group and multi-level selection and the evolution of altruism, and showing actually that the evolutionary process is choosing for that good of the whole and choosing toward what can become a planetary altruism. And that epiphany has not come from spiritual people. That has come from data sets from mainly materialist scientists who are then have discovered, oh my gosh, natural selection has these three different ways of working. And one of the major one is choosing for the good of the whole. And that implies that our behavior is moving in the same direction that the great wisdom traditions have also taught. So our colleagues in that realm, David Sloan Wilson and E.O. Wilson, who have really been pioneering that new paradigm of cooperative evolution, it's really a part of this this confluence that's going on. So it's just nice to have a chance to bring in that side of it as an evolutionary biologist.
And I'd like to take the talking stick on from Kurt then. What we're now finding as a cosmologist, what we're now finding is it's not just biological evolution we're talking about. It's a universe that embodies an evolutionary impulse and has done so for 13.8 billion years, from simplicity to complexity and individuated self-awareness. So the evidence is also showing us, as many eminent scientists have also themselves maintained, such as Einstein, Max Planck, Schrödinger, James Jeans, many, this is a universe where mind and consciousness aren't something we have. They're literally what we and the whole world are. So we have this more fundamental convergence of science and spirituality at the deep level of the nature of fundamental reality. And so that sort of perception of trying to hold, it's falling away. As Neil said, unity differentiates itself. Unity boundaries itself, but unity is inseparable. So when we literally wake up to that perception, then we also see that the biological evolution is a continuation of simplicity to complexity, but always for the good of the whole. But now to go beyond human consciousness and talk about universal consciousness, and a universe that itself is, meaningfully existing, purposefully evolving, a sentient living universe where we are its microcosmic co-creators. And I think this is such a grand, amazing, new unitive narrative that is convergent with universal wisdom teachings. But as you say, Paul, it's for everyone. This is our heritage. This is our lineage. This is our evolutionary potential. And so it's far, far more important than a few folks that are, following particular methodologies to come to this perspective. But those perspectives are crucial, because if we're still tied into the old fragmentation, the material separation, then it's actually acting as a lag to what is an inherent evolutionary impulse that's flowing through us and flowing through our planetary home Gaia and flowing through our entire universe.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I agree. If we have a more materialistic mindset, it is a bit of a barrier. And that's why books like this and many others just begin to open our thinking process up. And that allows some of these impulses and our inherent natural existence to begin to emerge through. And I also want to add, Jude, what you were speaking about, I thought of Rupert Sheldrake's book, Set Science Free. And I was thinking part of this book is Set Scientists Free. But beyond that, I want to say that based on all the discoveries that you mentioned, and Bob and Kurt and Neil, that science is in some ways setting itself free. Yeah. With all these discoveries, it's leading to an inevitable conclusion about the unity of everything, the conscious unity of everything. And we're just trying to help wake up more individuals along the way, so each person can enjoy the gifts and benefits of living from that perspective.
It's an invitation, isn't it?
It's an invitation. I hope everyone accepts it. Neil.
Can I pick up that talking stick? And I think you said this could have been around a book of any constituted group of people. But the thing about having it come from scientists, we live in a really bizarre culture from the point of view of human history. This idea that science, empirical science and formal mathematics are the ways to understand truth. And there's this idea that in our culture that that's the case. And that's funny for a couple of reasons. The first is that the people who believe that in our general culture, which is sort of anyone you might talk to walking down the street for the most part, harbors beliefs that have nothing to do with empirical science or formal logic and can't be proven or described by those. So there's this split in people's heads. But culturally, we've set scientists and mathematicians as those ultimate arbiters. That isn't a typical standard for human culture. And it really blossomed in the most, I think, complete way in Vienna after World War I, with a group of philosophers and scientists and mathematicians and logicians, sociologists, called the Vienna Circle. And setting aside what they saw as all this medieval church-based European way of viewing metaphysics, metaphysics was to be abolished. And things were to be set on this scientific and logical path. They failed. But, and they failed because quantum physics said there is no separation between subject and object at the most fundamental levels of existence. That's well known. But formal logic failed because Kurt Gödel came along with the incompleteness theorems and said there will always be truths that can be demonstrated to be true, but cannot be proven to be true within our systems. And so their whole approach failed. But Hitler invaded Austria. All those people scattered to the four corners of the earth where they got prominent appointments. They'd already been very influential. They got prominent appointments in science and philosophy departments around the world. And their influence sort of helped to create and reify this milieu where empirical science and formal logic are everything. But the fact is they failed. They're not everything. They can't explain everything. So for you to come through and take empiricists like us and demonstrate that if we are imbibing all of this and still see that it isn't sufficient to say what truth is, then that empowers other people to let go of this as well. And I think it's not only to loosen up scientists, but to loosen up everyone else's internal conflicts between they believe it's all about science and math. But in fact, what they believe is there are non-material worlds out there, and there are experiences that can't be captured in physics, so I think it's and I don't think anyone else has done it like this. It has the potential to be a profound wedge for people.
Thank you, Neil. I can see how your deep Zen contemplation brought this great insight that you just shared all about the further applicability of this book, having started in focusing on scientists and how that might help others who are non-scientists. Because if we can overcome this kind of illusion of separation and materialism, anybody can, because we're deeply trained how to stay there.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. And we're going to move to the next phase. And I'd like to bring on Dr. Robert Atkinson, who's one of the editors at Light on Light Press. And again, Robert, thank you for all of your deep support for getting this book created. And I know you'd like to chat with us about the evolution of consciousness towards wholeness. And you are one of the 4 spotlight authors in the book. And this has been one of your expertise areas about the nature of consciousness continually moving towards wholeness. And so please proceed.
Thank you, Paul, so much. It's really a pleasure to be part of this book launch and to have contributed a spotlight to this groundbreaking, really rich book, which illustrates so well how innate potential is fulfilled and how we can live into wholeness in 2 ways. First, by showing that the evolution of consciousness does lead toward wholeness and unity. And second, by showing that in fulfilling this potential, we follow a timeless pattern underlying all versions of a universal transformative process. Mm-hmm. What intrigued me most about this book from the very beginning is that it is structured upon a pattern, a framework that is at the very core of many ways of knowing. This pattern is very evident in a glance at the table of contents. Each chapter takes us through a journey of awakening that leads to wholeness step by step. And this is a pattern that also highlights the awareness of the responsibility that comes with having experienced it, which is to give back to others in whatever way we are best suited for. Mm-hmm. So in my book, A New Story of Wholeness, an experiential guide for connecting the human family, coming out the middle of next month, I explore how this pattern can be seen as an avenue of transformation in various expressions, from myth to mysticism to initiatory rites to psychology. So in mythology, Joseph Campbell pulled together the archetypes of the world's myths to form the pattern consisting of departure, initiation, return. In ritual, Arnold van Gennep identified the pattern that all rites of passage follow as separation, transition, and corporation. In mysticism, Evelyn Underhill describes the mystic way as following a pattern that leads from awakening to purification, to illumination, to a dark night of the soul, to union, or living in harmony with the whole. And in psychology, Carl Jung called this the individuation process, which consists of the conscious experience of the archetypes we are born with, embedded in our unconscious, bubbling up from within, released by life experiences, making us aware of their innate existence and enabling the merging of opposites into a new whole. This is a process involving the birth of the ego, the death of the ego, and the birth of the whole self. Mm-hmm. All these variations of the same pattern emerge from the familiar storyline of beginning, middle, and end. Yet, what they all represent on a deeper level is beginning, muddle, resolution. another variation of the same pattern. So we can really identify this rough outline of this ageless pattern as follows, as following three archetypes: the call to wholeness, path to purification, and the return to wholeness. And what's I could go through each of the motifs of each of those three major archetypes, but what's really interesting about the book, too, is that it contributes such a great deal to understanding how this pattern is expressed in the spiritual lives of these scientists and beyond. The book also illustrates that science and spirituality are not only representations of this wholeness, but are also equal partners in this wholeness.
Yeah.
So it conveys how the personal experience of wholeness heals the divide between science, spirit, and spirituality, reason and faith, separation and union. And we end up with a rich collection of unitive narratives that tell how we can experience wholeness when we are open to all aspects of reality. So I was thinking it would be really interesting if we can bring our guests back to see how this pattern may seem to fit their experience, whether they were aware of the pattern or not, and what deeper meaning and awareness of living a universal pattern may have given them.
I'd love to hear that. And I'll begin by, I appreciated the big picture of our evolutionary journey, the way you described it through all these different philosophical insights from Campbell and others. One of the interviewees in the book, Dusanna Dorje, she said all of us have what she called an I am instinct. And it's essentially an instinct deep in our consciousness to uncover who we are. What are we really fundamentally beyond our mind-body existence as a human being, which is, of course, utterly beautiful in and of itself. But there's so much more to discover. And the final chapter, as you all know, of the book goes more deeply into these journeys across a number of different philosophies and meditations, cultures, and so forth, as a kind of a guide for people who are interested in pursuing more along this journey. So thank you for that, Bob. Yeah, but Neil or Jude or Kurt, comments on this idea of your own insights along these major passage points on the journey.
Yeah, well, one thing I wanted to say, simply because it really illustrates then how this book arrived on our desk and how we built it out when Deepak joined and Ken Wilber joined and the other spotlighters joined, and we expanded this, and we're in contract actually with Paul for a second book, which will actually build the conversation out to physics, cosmology, economics, evolution, and all the other areas of science, because we've seen that it's so rich. This quick comment I want to make is all of us here, have been polymaths, and being polymaths didn't make sense at a certain part of our career lives. We had a degree in this, we had a degree in this, we'd done this, we'd done this, and it didn't make sense at that time. But what's so profoundly true now, and it was so, illustrated by this book arriving on our desk, is that these things now are just inevitably coming together. And that's what really then also birthed the book. So I thought I would just throw that insight in.
Thank you, Kurt.
I'll be delighted to carry on from that. I was just thinking the same thing, Kurt. And it reminded me what Neil was saying. You were saying that you did that, and then you did that, and then you did that. My journey too has been a scenic route, and it's, and I actually, I don't know if anyone else had, I never saw a destination. Literally, it was just that sense of curiosity and sort of going, oh yes, and just following. And only, was it, I can't remember now. Kurt, you'll remember. The philosopher that said, we live life forward and we understand it backwards.
Somebody will have to remind me.
I know, I'm sorry. But that's very much my sense of my own journey. I've followed these very...
Schopenhauer.
Thank you. Very, very, very scenic routes. But when I look back, I see that they've confluenced, many, many tributaries. There was a river that's taken me to this point. And when I do look back and when I do live my life now, it is from that unitive embodiment. And yet the journey goes on. And I'm delighted and joyous that it is. And it just feels to me that, we have come here, all of us, and Shamini and everyone else, to be in service, I hope, at this time, to invite others into this awakening, to invite others into this grand adventure of the universe, really, and the evolutionary impulse that it embodies, and that we can actually, in a way, step up to be its co-evolutionary partners. Because that, I feel, is our destiny. And as Neil, you said, for me, it's about showing up too and getting out of the way.
Yeah. Thank you, Jude. Beautiful.
Yeah, so since you mentioned the word complexity, Jude, the title of my new book is Notes on Complexity. And the first half is complexity theory and the sort of stuff I've talked about. And then the second half is consciousness and the Vienna Circle and how they messed us up and how Kurt Gödel saved us, blah, blah, blah. And I've been talking about this stuff for 20 years, and on the way have gathered more parts of it because I speak about it, and then people reflect it back at me and say, oh, have you thought about this, etc. And for 20 years, I've thought, maybe there's a book here. Maybe there's a book here. No, that would be beyond me to write. And then, in part thanks to COVID, unintended consequences, it seemed to be the moment to do it. And in doing so, it's making me look back and go, there were times in my life when I was younger and I felt really lost in a lot of ways. And going to medical school was a big part of that because it was not the right place for me. I was thinking pragmatically. That was a wrong turn. It worked out well finally in the end, but and now I look back and it's like, no, this all sort of makes sense now. All of that stuff wandering about. One of the things I use in my talks in the book is ants, and they wander around until they happen to encounter other ants that have found things, or bump into some food themselves. And then suddenly things shift and things self-organize, and now there's a food line where there wasn't before. And these kind of conversations are like ants wandering around, and we discover each other. And a book like this is, oh, look, there's a food line for me. And so there are those transformational moments. I don't know the language of either Jung or aging brain. Who were we just talking about? Campbell. Well enough to put it in those forms, but I get a sense of, oh, this is not the first time this sort of thing has happened. And it's not the first time it's happened in the universe or on planet Earth or within human minds and cultures or within ourselves. And so my sense is that, yeah, those are the threads that come through here, whether we name them something or not. Yeah, there's a truth I'm getting from what you're saying that jives with how I'm now suddenly feeling it after, in my 7th decade. So.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. That's a really, I think, a fairly common way of putting it, even with people who may not be familiar with the pattern. Once they do become familiar with it, they recognize, first of all, that they're not alone, that their experience is not solitary. Mm-hmm. And in doing that, they recognize that they have experienced what Jung describes as archetypes bubbling up from the unconscious, which makes us even more aware that through our experiences like these that are all throughout the book, we recognize that we're more connected to the whole human family than we ever thought we were.
Indeed. I appreciate those final few points there, because my hope is that by reading the different stories within the book, it will jog memories and open up opportunities and also provide validation for the experiences of whoever is reading the book. Because all these things are natural within us. we have them, we might discount them and then move back into our more dualistic perception. But when we can read about the experiences of others and we have a sense of validation, and then we can go more forward to embrace our own experiences. And that's really a fundamentally important part of the book as well. Thank you all for joining this launch. I'm going to pass the baton back to you, Kurt. I know you've got some closing comments, and thank you all for participating.
Yeah, thanks so much, Paul. And actually, because we're still within our time limit here, I'm actually going to pass it back to Paul just one more time, give him a chance to do just a bit of a wrap up, both in the sense of the message and all of the data, everything. What is it you'd really like to say about this book before we then close out? So Paul, over to you.
There are quite enough. Thank you, Kurt. There are quite a few messages in the book, and I think we've covered a number of them during this conversation. If I were to highlight what I would consider the most important message, the message is what I was just speaking to a bit, and that is each of us as human beings, we have such a deeper identity than most of us are typically aware of. And when we don't live from that more fundamental identity, then we live in a world of separation of me and you and us and them and so forth. When we begin to embrace a journey of consciousness development, of spiritual journey to really understand our true nature, as people call it, sometimes it's called the true self with a capital S, then the prior perceptions of separation begin to dissolve away naturally, because now we've come back into residing in that more whole unitive nature of our existence. And everything changes from there. The nature of our life, certainly, meaning, how we relate to others, how we relate to society at large, and we transform ourselves and the work we're doing, regardless of whatever career we're engaged in. So I hope this book provides some insight and encouragement for everyone to embrace that journey if you're not already on it, or to continue it with enthusiasm and open-heartedness if you're already on that journey.
Yeah, Paul, so thank you so much. So here we are again, and actually it's amazing how apt the cover is here. The designer must have been tuned in. Here we are, and here's everything available to us. So that's the journey that we're all a part of, as Bob so well said. Mm-hmm. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us, and with special thanks to the author of Science, Being, and Becoming, The Spiritual Lives of Scientists, Dr. Paul J. Mills, and to his guests, Drs. Robert Atkinson, Jude Currivan, Shamini Jain, and Neil Theise. So Science, Being, and Becoming is available now at all booksellers, and you can also learn more about it at lightonlight.us and at SacredStories.com. And also start watching the video series for Science, Being, and Becoming that's on YouTube at the Sacred Stories channel. So that's YouTube at the Sacred Stories channel. We've actually posted the first video there already. And as well, there's going to be a Voice America program, this Voice America special, on November 18th at the Light on Light series there. For that, you can just Google The Convergence at Voice America. That's The Convergence at Voice America. And that is scheduled to post on November 18th with both Paul and also with Bob, and with some attention as well to Bob's new book from Light on Light Press, A New Story of Wholeness, an experiential guide for connecting humanity. So we know that you're all going to really enjoy Science, Being, and Becoming, the Spiritual Lives of Scientists. And we thank you all so much for joining us today. Have a wonderful day.